Welcome to Resourced and Resourceful Leadership, a podcast for people who care about the world and their impact in it. I'm your host, Dr. Christine Pettit. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm really glad that you're here, and I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your reactions to the episodes or anything that you would like me to talk about. And you can do this by sending a message for me through SpeakPipe. So I'll share more about that at the end of the episode. In just a few days here, if you're listening in real time, on October 20th, I'm celebrating 2 years of being all in on my business, which is very creatively named Dr. Christine Pettit Coaching and Consulting. So I thought I'd use this episode to share a bit about the jump that I made from being a full-time employee to being a full-time entrepreneur and some of the things that I've learned the past few years. I will say that this is an evolution, and it is something that started far beyond the 2 years that I've been all in on my business. Did some consulting in about 2011. So I think it was 12 years prior to ever going all in on my business. And it's been something that has that kind of freelance organizational development work and coaching work has been something that I have honed my craft and been able to work on inside and outside of my 9 to 5. Not that I've ever really had a 9 to 5. I joke about my business name being very creative. It's straightforward. It is what it is. It's my name, coaching and consulting. At one point, I called it CP Coaching and Consulting, then Christine Pettit Coaching and Consulting, and I'm embracing the fact that I do have a PhD, and so I've added the doctor in there as well. In this episode, I'm going to share a little bit about advice that I've heard from people that I look up to about going solo or starting a business outside of the traditional W-2 or 9 to 5 roles. And I'm going to reflect on some of the things that they've shared as well as my own experience. Part of my journey has been considering entrepreneurship. I think there's a few things that I just want to share about my experience with work. So for one, I've had, no exaggeration, over 30 jobs in my life. At one point, I sat down and I counted them all. I started working really before my first official job, where I was hired when I was 14 to work at a fast food kind of drive-through type place. And before that, I had earned money babysitting and even cleaning for my grandma. She would give me money and chores, things like that. So I definitely, but the babysitting, I mean, I got paid not from family to care for children before I was 14. And then when I was 14, I got hired at Bodie's, a sports drive-in. It is no longer, it's now a Subway, which I've worked at 2 Subways in my life, and that's not one of them. But over the years, so from 14 to now 46, I've worked in over 30 jobs. And I often had more than one job at a time. And my jobs have ranged significantly. Food service, taking notes as part of as a college student, taking notes for those who would access them through the Disabled Student Resource Center, modeling, writing for newspapers, I've been a personal assistant. I'm just trying to think of some of the interesting ones. I've called alumni at Cal State LA and asked for donations. So those are just some examples of that early work history. And then I would say my work has been non-traditional for a really long time because not only did I work all through college, usually multiple jobs, but then I was in grad school and I got a PhD. And so even that was really weaving together different sources of income and just making it work. I'm thinking my first really full-time non-hodgepodge job may have been when I became the executive director for a nonprofit. I was certainly working more than full-time a lot of times as a graduate student, as a president of the union, but I guess all that to say, I've had a very varied work experience, and so maybe part of that made it easier for me to think about non-traditional work. Another thing that really factors into my mindset around my business is that I do have a certain level of confidence in my ability to get work because I've never had a hard time with employment. I'm fortunate in that way. And not only have I never had a hard time, I've often been overemployed and worked too much or had too many jobs and things going on. And so my challenge has been really to say no to work sometimes. Okay. So all that to say, another thing to know about how I geared up to go out on my own in business is that I considered it a few times. I considered it when I was leaving an executive director position, and I thought then I might go into full-time coaching and consulting. I didn't know. I knew it was time to leave the organization, but I didn't know what I was going to do next per se, or I didn't have a job lined up. And so that at that point I was exploring going into full-time coaching and consulting. I had just finished my coaching certification and I was doing occasional projects here and there as a organizational development consultant. So I had that experience under my belt of already starting to coach and occasionally doing organizational development work and doing board retreats for nonprofits, things like that. Then in 2021, when I transitioned out of the executive director role, I got recruited into applying for another role. And in that organization, I was in the senior leadership team, and I was there for 2 years and 9 months before I was laid off. And during that time, I was able to do some coaching, have some coaching clients, and also still do some organizational consulting. I stayed active in my craft throughout that period, working in that organization. Ultimately, there was a lot of good that came out of working in that organization, and I really valued the people that I worked with and the work that the organization does. But it just became clear it was not a good fit. And ultimately, I was laid off from that position, and that position was eliminated. And I thought it made a lot of sense organizationally. And I can talk about it pretty lightly now, but I will say there was some strife in all of that. There was some pain there. And So I knew at a certain point it was time for me to look at what was next for me. And I knew that prior to getting laid off, like I had my sights on my next steps and was starting to put that kind of into play, thinking about how to get ready. When I count the day that I was laid off as my all-in day. I literally got laid off and then went to a networking event a few hours later. And I was like, all right, here I am. I'm all in. So that was the start of full-time Dr. Christine Pettit coaching and consulting. Also, during this time period, I was listening to a lot of podcasts on, like, all throughout working in that last position. I was listening to podcasts about business, about marketing, about coaching, and I was trying things out, but without the pressure to sustain myself in that way. So I had a lot of freedom to learn and to try out some marketing and just kind of have fun with it and not have that pressure. And I'm really grateful for that time too, because it helped lay a foundation for how I was thinking about and could approach business. And also it allowed me to practice things with confidence too, and to develop more confidence in what I was doing and how I was approaching business. So I would say in tandem with my learning about business, I also started to learn more about money and finances. And I would like to do an episode on money, probably more than one episode on money at some point. But some of the people that I learn about money from too, it's helped inform just that process of being able to take the leap into my own business and being more confident in my ability to navigate my finances and to sustain myself in a healthy way, and kind of take away some of the, I think I had an opportunity too to work through asking for higher rates and putting my work, valuing my work at a higher rate. And again, I got to just like play around with that and develop things. Like I have a equity-based sliding scale too, and I learned this from some of the different kind of influences in my sphere. All that to say, I've talked to people and they're like, wow, you have done so well in your first 2 years of business. And I have done well. I feel very successful in my business. It wasn't like I was starting from zero on day one. There's a lot of work and preparation and experience that I've had that have helped really lay that foundation. I feel like I'm still laying a foundation for what's next in my business. Some things that I've learned or heard that are interesting to me is just this idea of overnight success. A lot of times when someone is getting a lot of accolades or fame, usually there's a lot of work and a lot of behind the scenes and trial and error that you don't see there. So I share that just to share a little bit about the way I'm thinking about the work that I'm doing and the continuation of it. When I was evaluating if I was going to go the consultant route in 2021, I was having a lot of conversations. I think I talked to maybe 10 people. I asked them if I could do interviews with them about what it was like to have their own business or be a freelancer. And that was really helpful just in talking with them, getting practical advice, and also getting the confidence that I could do this. And that's another beautiful thing that I really value about the consultant community, the coach community, and just the people in my life, that there's a lot of willingness to collaborate and share information. And that is something that I really value and that I also try to embody. Okay, so cut to February of this year. There were 2 podcasts that came out that made me start to reflect on my journey of going solo. And one of them is a Healthy Rich podcast episode that came out in February 2025. I don't have the name here in my notes, so I will link that in the show notes. But the Healthy Rich podcast is done by Dana Miranda, and she writes on Substack, and I came across her and I really appreciated her approach to finance. I actually want to look it up really quickly because I liked the way she describes it. Let's see. Dana Miranda. She writes the Healthy Rich newsletter too. It's about how capitalism impacts the ways we think, teach, and talk about money. And she has a book, You Don't Need a Budget. I have not read it yet, but I've liked what I've heard from her. I've mainly listened to her on her podcast. She also describes the podcast, Money Talk for Misfits, certified educator in personal finance and author of You Don't Need a Budget, Dana Miranda answers your burning money questions. I was starting to say that I've been on this kind of journey of learning more about money. The first person that I started kind of watching on Instagram is Vivian too, and she would talk about being your rich BFF. So I was learning things there, and I think that led me to Financial Feminist by Tori Dunlap, and she has her kind of business first 100K. And so it's like learning about finances with a feminist twist, or like learning about budget, looking at capitalism and systems of oppression. And so both Dana Miranda and Tori Dunlap, I think, do that pretty well in the work that they put out. And they're very different and at different scales. And then the other person, I got a recommendation from a friend / my personal trainer. She told me about Rachel Rodgers' book, We Should All Be Millionaires. And Rachel Rodgers really speaks to women of color, folks who've been marginalized from that perspective around learning about finances, pricing, all of that. And so anyway, I would say those 3 are people that I have been learning about money from and really appreciated on this journey. All of them, I think, have something about like building a business. Some are more focused on that than others. So there were these 2 podcasts that came out in February of this year. I was very much like already in the throes of my business. In fact, at that point, I was an interim executive director plus my business. Things were wild, but I was still listening to my podcast. And these 2 podcasts came out around the same time in February, where Dana Miranda's was answering questions about that move from a full-time job to going or like thinking about freelancing. And then Rachel Rodgers' Hello 7 podcast, that title I actually wrote down here, How to Quit Your Job and Go Solo. So these 2 came out and it just made me reflect on my journey. And I've been thinking about doing something like this, like doing a video or a podcast and sharing what they shared along with my journey. So thanks for listening and thanks for following along. Okay, so Dana Miranda, she gives 2 pieces of advice for achieving some sense of stability while making the move from employment to freelancing. So her first piece of advice is adjust your mindset to realize that traditional employment isn't necessarily more stable than self-employment. It's just a more common path, so it looks more stable. I mean, we're seeing these layoffs right now, including jobs that were once traditionally considered pretty stable, government jobs. And I think that is like the illusion of the stability of a 9-to-5 job, is that so much of it is at your employer's whim, and it can be taken away in an instant. And so although it's common and comfortable, it's not necessarily more stable. And in fact, if you have multiple clients and kind of multiple sources of revenue, I would argue that is more stable. It's really nice to get a regular check and to know what to expect every month. And I totally get the appeal of that stability. And the nice thing about doing interim executive work or interim executive director work for me is that sometimes I do get that stable paycheck. But now that kind of work is one source of revenue for me versus a solo source of income. So I like the idea of thinking about freelancing or entrepreneurship as potentially just as or more stable than having a traditional job. Thinking about those different kind of threads of income or different, how you can have different clients. It depends on the work that you do. But the stability of traditional employment is not guaranteed. And then her second piece of advice is to set yourself up financially as much as you can before taking the leap. And she outlines 4 steps to freelancing. Strengthen your craft, pitch your ideas, get some work and get work samples, and then repeat. Continue to strengthen your craft, pitch ideas, get work samples, repeat. In the Rachel Rodgers Hello 7 podcast on how to quit your job and go solo, she advocates for a 5-step transition plan. The first one is to run the numbers, to really understand what you need on a monthly basis to survive and thrive at a base level. This is something that a friend of mine advised too as I was contemplating making that shift to full-time entrepreneurship or full-time business owner life. She was like, just see how much do you actually need to live on? Like, what are your actual expenses? And Rachel Rodgers, she talks about like looking at how much money you're netting. To me, I'm not as concerned about what I'm netting as I am like, what am I actually spending every month or every year? Getting clear on that helped me realize like I actually, to survive and do decently, I didn't need to make as much as I was making in my job. And just knowing that, having that number, whether it's I need more, because let's face it, some of our 9-to-5 jobs are not sustainable. But for some, it might be I actually need my business to be more lucrative than this job that I have over here. For some, in my case, it was like, it's okay if I don't bring in as much money as I currently am. I will be okay. This is what I need. Rachel also recommends looking at any expenses that you won't have once you quit your job. Maybe you pay for dry cleaning that you won't need to, or a commute. Something I was thinking about is like, maybe you're eating out a lot because you're so busy at work and you're not packing a lunch or whatever. So meals might be something that won't be as expensive. But number one, run the numbers, know how much you need to survive and thrive at a base level, and also see if there's anything that you'd want to cut, just to get a sense of what you really need there. Number two, figure out your health insurance. And she talks about how this is like a big hang up for people. And I totally get it, because it's been a hang up for me too. But I talked to people who, are like, yeah, it's just another bill that I have. And so Rachel says in the podcast, if you can pay rent, you can pay health insurance. And it's just a matter of figuring out what your options are and paying for them. Does your work have COBRA, the job that you're leaving? Granted, in my experience, it's very expensive. Can you get it on the marketplace? Are you married or in a partnership with someone who can share their health insurance? If you're young, I think under 26, can you be on your parents' health insurance? So figuring out the health insurance piece is number two. For me, I was able to get a few months of health insurance covered as I left. And then I was looking into options for what to buy. Ultimately, my partner and I decided to become domestic partners in California. And doing that, he was able to share his health insurance with me. And so I have health insurance coverage through my partner. But there are a lot of ways that you can get health insurance coverage. Number three, come up with a contingency plan. So there is advice about how to, what you should have in terms of your emergency savings, or in this case, Rachel talks about, this is not the common advice of saving a year's worth of expenses. That's not feasible for a lot of us, but look around at what's available to you. Do you have assets like a 401k that you could borrow against? Can you get unemployment? Is there a package you can get for leaving your company? She recommends getting a line of credit before you leave your job. Do you want to sell some things? She talks about going from a nicer car to a hoopty. So just, maybe you do have some money saved, but having a plan and knowing kind of what you have at your disposal, or like what's available to you, and having a runway of a few months of expenses is helpful to think about. What do I need to do if I'm not replacing this income right away? And in my experience, you do need somewhat of a runway. And it took a while before I was getting more predictable and consistent income. And I think, with the nature of my work, it could ebb and flow. So having that contingency plan in place has been important for me. I also have the benefit of having a partner who makes a good living and who could help support or make up for a lack of income if it came to it. I'm really grateful, and it does allow me that cushion. And so I'm so grateful. We talked about it before I was laid off and when I was thinking about leaving my job. And so I knew he would be supportive and could be supportive. So I do have that privilege and that cushion. And I haven't had to use it, but I'm grateful that he is part of my contingency plan. So that is part of it. Now, you don't have to have a partner to do that, but I'm just sharing that I know there's some risks that are easier for me to take because of that. On the other hand, it is hard for me to take the risk because I'm not just footloose and fancy free. I have a partner and I have a child who are counting on me, so there is that pressure. The next steps that Rachel recommends in her episode are start your side hustle and get to selling. She talks about using your monthly number and trying to get to that and working evenings and working weekends. And that might be what you need if you're interested in this to like psychologically feel like you could make the leap from your job. I did not do that, but I had my side hustle. I was coaching consistently. I was doing some organizational development work, more like one-off things. I'm doing more substantial work now. But doing that allowed me to bring in more income, hone my craft, stay active in it, and build that confidence. I recommend doing it for that reason, to get used to selling, get used to asking, and maybe going for a price that is higher than you feel comfortable doing, or like creating a sliding scale or whatever that looks like for you. But it allows you some buffer time, if you have it, to learn some things about business before you're doing it full time. And then she talks about joining an entrepreneurial community. And of course, that's one of her offers. But I will say, I just find it to be very valuable to be connected with other people who are doing similar things. I have found fellow consultants to be incredibly generous, and I try to bring that same generosity to the people in my network who are starting out, or even who aren't starting out, but just like we always have things to learn from one another and to share. And I really believe that there's enough work to go around. And even if you're not kind of in the same industry or space, I mean, I think in the case of Rachel Rodgers is like the Hello 7 entrepreneurial community, you probably have people coming from all over the place. And I just find it valuable to create that community, to learn from one another, and also just, so you're not so alone especially if you're on the solopreneur route, building those connections and finding others who are values aligned, who are willing to share their experiences. There's a lot of value there. Thank you for the opportunity to just reflect. And I'm thanking myself for giving myself the opportunity to reflect on getting started. I'm curious if you have any questions for me about business over the last 2 years or the last 15 years almost. And I think that's a good segue into wrapping up for today. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Resourced and Resourceful Leadership Podcast. If you want to hear more of this podcast, please follow or subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. To support the show, please leave a 5-star review and share the show with a few people who you think would appreciate it. And please check out the link to SpeakPipe in the show notes. I'd love it if you left me a message about what stood out to you from the show or topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes. Thanks again, and take good care.